The first thing everyone admired was the house. White stone walls, wide glass windows, a terrace that opened toward the forest. Every guest who stepped inside said the same thing. "You're so lucky." They said it with envy, with admiration. I smiled every time. What they didn't know was that the house was never really mine. I was 34 when my husband, Mark, suggested we move out of the city. I was a corporate lawyer, exhausted by endless contracts and glass offices that smelled like ambition and stress. He said the countryside would give us peace, space, a future. "This will be our home," he told me, standing on the empty land, his arm around my shoulders. "Something solid, something that lasts." I believed him. I invested more than money. I invested trust. I helped negotiate with contractors. I reviewed agreements late at night. I paid for design changes, landscaping, even part of the construction when Mark said cash flow was temporarily tight. I never questioned it. We were married. We were a team. Or so I thought. The first crack appeared quietly. It was a dinner with his parents, Victor and Elaine, in the new house, just weeks after we moved in. Elaine walked through the living room slowly, her fingers brushing the furniture as if inspecting an unfamiliar hotel. "You did a lovely job," she said, smiling thinly. "Of course, it still feels like a family house." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "A family house," I repeated lightly. "Yes," she said. "This land has history. It belongs with the right name." Victor cleared his throat and changed the subject. Mark avoided my eyes. That night, I asked him about it. "You're overthinking," he said. "My mother just talks like that." But the words stayed with me. Over the following months, small things began to feel off. Mail stopped arriving in my name. Contractors called Mark directly, even when I was listed as the contact. When I tried to add my name to the utility accounts, I was told it was already settled. By whom? Mark brushed off every question with practiced ease. Paperwork delays. Administrative nonsense. "You deal with contracts all day. Relax at home." That sentence should have been my warning. The real alarm came the day I found the folder. It was hidden in Mark's study, behind old financial reports. A slim binder, carefully labeled. Property documents. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a warranty. But when I opened it, my breath caught. The house deed was there. Only one name appeared on it. Not mine. Not even Mark's. Victor Hale. His father. I read it twice. 3 times. My legal training kicked in instantly, cold and sharp. Ownership structure. Registration date. Legal signatures. The house had never belonged to us. Not jointly. Not temporarily. Never. I sat down slowly, the folder trembling in my hands. Every payment I had made. Every decision. Every night spent believing I was building a future. All of it had been carefully redirected into someone else's asset. I confronted Mark that evening. He didn't panic. That was the worst part. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said calmly. My voice shook. "Why isn't my name on the deed?" He sighed, like a man exhausted by a difficult employee. "It's complicated." "No," I replied. "It's deliberate." He leaned back in his chair. "My parents wanted protection. In case things didn't work out." "Protection from whom?" "From me. So I live in a house I don't own," I said. "That I helped pay for." "You're my wife," he said. "What's the difference?" The difference was everything. Over the next weeks, the pressure escalated. Elaine began showing up unannounced, commenting on my schedule, my tone, my stress levels. "You work too much," she said sweetly. "It can make women unstable." Victor suggested a post-nuptial agreement for clarity. Mark started keeping records of my work hours, my late nights, my phone calls. And then came the word I feared most: concern. "We're just concerned about you," Elaine said one afternoon. "You seem overwhelmed." Concern, I realized, was their weapon. They weren't just trying to keep the house from me. They were preparing to erase me from it. And as I stood alone in the living room that night, surrounded by walls I had helped build but never truly owned, one truth settled deep inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. and they had been executing it from the very beginning. But what they didn't know, what they would soon regret, was that they had chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. Because I wasn't just living in their house. I was about to dismantle their entire structure, legally, methodically, and without mercy. And this time, everything would be in writing. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was pretending I hadn't seen it. Every morning, I walked through that house as if nothing had changed. I poured coffee into the same cups, sat at the same kitchen island, listened to Mark talk about his meetings with the same careless confidence. Inside, I was cataloging everything. Because once you realize someone is trying to erase you, you stop reacting emotionally. You start documenting. I didn't confront them again. That would have been useless. People like Mark and his parents didn't confess when cornered, they escalated. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do my entire career. I built a case. It started with money. Late one night, after Mark fell asleep, I accessed our shared financial software. He thought he'd locked me out months ago. What he didn't realize was that I had created a mirrored access point years earlier, back when we still trusted each other. The numbers told a story he never intended me to read. My payments, labeled as household contributions, had been redirected into Victor's holding company. Construction invoices were issued to an entity Mark and his father controlled jointly. The house wasn't just registered under Victor's name. It was strategically shielded. Layered trusts, temporary proxies, clauses designed to survive divorce, death, or litigation. This wasn't a family decision made out of fear. It was a corporate operation. And I had helped finance it. The next piece fell into place when Elaine invited me to lunch. She chose a quiet restaurant. Neutral territory. Public enough to appear harmless. "You seem distant lately," she said, folding her napkin carefully. "Mark worries about you." Of course he did. "I've been busy," I replied. Elaine smiled, the kind that never reached her eyes. "You've always been intense." That's not a criticism. But intensity can cloud judgment. There it was. The narrative. She spoke slowly, deliberately, planting phrases like seeds. Overworked, emotional, obsessive, unstable. Each word landed with intention. I let her talk. Because every manipulator eventually reveals their script. "You know," she continued, "if something were ever to happen between you and Mark, we'd want to make sure everyone was protected. Especially you." Protected. From myself. That night, I requested copies of my medical records. The request alone triggered a response. 2 days later, Mark suggested I take time off. A week after that, Victor emailed recommending a neutral mediator. Elaine casually mentioned a therapist she trusted. They were closing in. What they didn't realize was that I had already found the weak point. The land. The house sat on property originally purchased through a family acquisition that violated zoning transition laws 15 years earlier. It had been grandfathered in barely. Any structural modification required updated disclosures. Disclosures they had never filed. One audit. One complaint. One properly timed legal motion, and the entire ownership structure could be challenged. I needed leverage. So I created it. I quietly formed a separate legal entity using my maiden name. Through it, I purchased a minority interest in the holding company. Victor used a loophole he never thought anyone would notice. The moment my signature entered their structure, everything changed. I now had rights, access, visibility. The house that had been used to trap me was becoming their liability. The final confirmation came accidentally. Or so Mark thought. He left his phone on the counter while showering. A message lit up the screen. "Elaine, she's not reacting fast enough. We may need to accelerate." Accelerate what? I didn't check the rest. I didn't need to. That night, lying beside my husband, I understood the truth with terrifying clarity. They weren't just planning to remove me from the house. They were preparing to remove me from the story entirely. But they had made one critical mistake. They assumed I was still playing defense. I wasn't. I was drafting the final version, and in it, they wouldn't recognize themselves. Because the house that was never meant for me was about to become the place where they lost everything. The shift was subtle at first. Not in their behavior, but in mine. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped justifying late nights, early mornings, unanswered calls. I let Mark believe his pressure was working, that I was retreating inward, becoming smaller, quieter. People like him mistake silence for surrender. They never realize it's often strategy. The first sign that something was wrong came when Victor requested a formal meeting. Family discussion, he called it. At the house. Of course. We sat at the long dining table, the one I had insisted on custom making, wide enough to host celebrations, contracts, and quiet wars. Elaine placed her hands neatly in front of her, composed. Mark sat beside her, unusually tense. Victor opened a folder. We've been reviewing some financial structures, he began. There are irregularities. I raised an eyebrow. Irregularities. Yes. A new entity appears in one of our holding layers. I smiled faintly. That happens. Mark stiffened. Victor leaned forward. The entity carries your maiden name. Silence. Elaine's eyes flicked to Mark. Just once. Sharp. Controlled. So you did see the documents, Mark said quietly. I read everything, I replied. That's what lawyers do. Elaine broke in smoothly. We were trying to protect you. From what? I asked. She hesitated. A fraction too long. From instability, she said. There it was again. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, letting the pause stretch. The forest outside was calm, indifferent to human schemes. You built this entire structure assuming I would notice, I said. Or that if I did, I'd panic. Victor's voice hardened. Careful. I turned back to them. You registered the property under an outdated zoning exception. You failed to disclose structural changes. You commingled funds from personal and corporate accounts. Mark looked at his father. What is she talking about? Victor didn't answer. Elaine spoke instead, her voice clipped now. This conversation is becoming inappropriate. No, I said. It's becoming accurate. I placed a folder on the table. Not thick. Not dramatic. Precise. By tomorrow morning, I continued, I will formally request a compliance audit. I will also file notice of my minority ownership interest. Victor stood abruptly. You wouldn't dare. I met his gaze calmly. I already did. The room changed. Not emotionally, structurally. For the first time, they weren't controlling the narrative. Mark's voice cracked. You're overreacting. I laughed softly. You forged a life around excluding me. That's not something people overreact to. Elaine's mask slipped. You think you can win? She snapped. You think anyone will believe you? I stepped closer to the table. Belief isn't required. Documentation is. The next days were chaos. Emails. Emergency calls. Advisors suddenly unavailable. Contractors refusing to proceed without updated approvals. The house, their fortress, had become a liability overnight. Mark tried a different approach. He cried. I was scared, he told me one evening. My parents pushed me. I didn't want to lose you. I listened. Then I said, you already did. When persuasion failed, they escalated. A letter arrived. A formal notice suggesting I undergo a psychological evaluation for the protection of all parties. Elaine's final move. I forwarded it directly to my attorney, along with 3 years of recorded communications, emails, and financial trails. The response was swift. A cease and desist. A counterclaim. A formal investigation request. Victor's lawyer called mine within hours. Elaine stopped coming to the house. Mark moved into the guest room. And for the first time since I discovered the truth, I slept through the night. Because I finally understood something essential. They hadn't underestimated my intelligence. They had underestimated my patience. And patience, when paired with evidence, is devastating. The house wasn't closing in on me anymore. It was collapsing around them. And all that remained was the final step, the one they would never recover from. The step where everything they tried to hide would be read aloud, signed, and sealed. In public. The final meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Victor insisted it be held at the house. Of course he did. Men like him believe territory equals power. That familiar walls will bend outcomes in their favor. That sitting at the head of a table they paid for somehow guarantees obedience. What Victor failed to understand was this. The house had already chosen sides. The conference room filled slowly. Lawyers, auditors, two representatives from the zoning authority, a compliance officer I had worked with years earlier, someone Victor clearly didn't recognize. Mark arrived last. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence he used to wear like armor now hung loose, heavy with fear. Elaine didn't come. That told me everything. Victor opened the meeting with practiced authority. We're here to resolve a misunderstanding. I didn't correct him. Let him believe that. The audit findings were presented first. Calmly. Methodically. No drama. Just facts. Undisclosed structural modifications. Improper fund transfers. Violation of trust governance rules. Misrepresentation of beneficial ownership. Each point landed like a quiet hammer. Victor's jaw tightened. This is excessive, he said. We've done nothing illegal. The compliance officer looked up. That's not what the documentation shows. I watched Mark's hands shake as pages were turned. Then it was my turn. I stood, placing a single folder on the table. Inside, it was the one thing Victor never expected me to have. Leverage. I'd like to clarify my position, I said evenly. My financial contributions to the property were consistently redirected into the holding structure without my informed consent. Victor scoffed. You were aware. No, I interrupted. I was misled. The word hung in the air. I continued. As a result, I initiated corrective legal action under my independent entity. That entity now holds a controlling interest. Silence. Victor's face drained of color. That's impossible, he said. I slid the document toward him. It was executed last night. Mark stood abruptly. You can't do this. I looked at him for the first time that day. You did this, I said quietly. I'm just closing the file. The zoning officer cleared his throat. Given the violations, the property status must be reevaluated. Victor's voice cracked. You're saying we lose the house? The officer nodded. Effective immediately. Ownership is suspended pending restructuring. Victor collapsed into his chair. The house he built his authority around gone. The silence stretched. Then the final document was read. A formal removal of Victor and Elaine from corporate control due to fiduciary misconduct. Mark stared at the table. You planned this, he whispered. I met his eyes. No, I said. I survived it. By the time the meeting ended, Victor no longer owned the house. Elaine no longer controlled the company. Mark no longer had a marriage. And I walked out with clean hands and full ownership, not just of assets, but of my own narrative. Weeks later, the house stood empty. I didn't move back in. Some places are meant to teach you who people are, not to keep you there. I sold the property quietly. The proceeds funded my new practice. Independent, transparent, unassailable. Sometimes people ask if I regret how it ended. I don't, because they tried to erase me using contracts and concern and silence. Instead, they taught me something invaluable. Never build your life on someone else's name. And never assume the woman reading quietly in the corner isn't rewriting the ending. Because the house that was never meant for me ended up taking everything from them instead.